Welcome to your Chapter 24 lecture. In Chapter 24, we're going to focus on life in the universe. Throughout this semester, we've explored the evidence that supports the modern scientific story of our universe. We've seen really strong evidence that we live in an expanding universe that was born about 14 billion years ago in the Big Bang. And life has been made possible by the recycling of gas and stars within our galaxy. We've seen how the processes that give birth to stars also give birth to planets, and we explored how our own planet came to be. But we haven't yet explored the most profound question of all. Are we alone? The universe contains worlds beyond our imagination. There's more than 100 billion star systems in our galaxy alone, and more than 100 billion large galaxies in our observable universe. But we do not yet know whether any world besides Earth has ever been home to life. In this chapter, we're going to discuss the current understanding of the origin of life on Earth and how we're using this understanding to consider the possibility of finding life elsewhere. In the process, we're going to see that the search for extraterrestrial life may have astonishing implications for our own future. So in this first section, we're going to explore life on Earth. The scientific interest in the possibility of alien life is quite real. The scientific search for life in the universe even has its own name, and we call that astrobiology. And that is the study of life on Earth and beyond. It emphasizes research into questions of the origin of life and the conditions under which life can survive and the search for life beyond. Most research in astrobiology actually focuses on one of three major areas. First, seeking to understand the origin and evolution of life on Earth so that we can learn the conditions under which life could arise and evolve elsewhere. Second, searching for worlds in our own solar system and beyond that might have the conditions that are suitable for life. And three, searching for evidence of actual life on other worlds. In this first section, we're going to focus our attention on the first area of astrobiology research, which is seeking to understand the origin of evolution of life on Earth so that we can learn the conditions where life could arise and evolve elsewhere. So we're going to answer the questions: when did life arise on Earth? How did life arise on Earth? And what are the necessities of life? So our first question is, when did life arise on Earth? An important step in learning about the origin and evolution of life on Earth is finding out when life first arose. We cannot draw definitive conclusions from the single example of Earth, but an early origin of life would be consistent with the idea that life can arise easily under the conditions that prevailed on the early Earth, while a late origin of life might suggest that it was difficult for life to arise, in which case, life on other worlds seems less likely. The weight of evidence today supports the idea that life arose quickly and easily on Earth. So on this picture on this slide here, you kind of see the history of life on Earth going from when Earth formed to when we saw different events on Earth, including kind of the earliest evidence of oxygen. You can see when plants and funguses made it onto land, mammals and dinosaurs, and even when humans actually appeared. So we're going to start by talking about the earliest life forms. When we learn about the history of life on Earth through the study of fossils, relics, and organisms that lived and died long ago. Most fossils form when dead organisms fall to the bottom of a sea or another body of water, and they get gradually buried by layers of sediments. The sediments are produced by erosion on land and carried by rivers to the sea. Over millions of years, the sediments then pile up on the seafloor, and the weight of the upper layers compresses the underlying layers into rock. Erosion or other tectonic activity can later expose the fossils on the surface. In some places like the Grand Canyon, the sedimentary layers record hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history. Some fossils are remarkably well preserved, but the majority of dead organisms decay completely and leave no fossils behind. Geologists have found a very few really old rocks that suggest that life was already thriving on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago, and possibly for hundreds of millions of years before that. So evidence from fossils and carbon isotopes tells us that life probably arose on Earth more than 3.85 billion years ago, shortly after the end of a heavy bombardment period. The key to reconstructing the history of life is to determine the dates when the fossil organisms lived. The relative ages of fossils found in different layers are easy to determine. Deeper layers formed earlier and contain more ancient fossils. The layers on top formed later and contain younger fossils. This is what we call relative ages or relative dating. So for example, if these are my layers of sediment here, we have layers A, B, and C. Fossils found in layer A are the oldest, and layer C are the youngest. C is near the surface, while A is deeper into Earth. So we see the deeper you go, there's an increase in age. Radiometric dating confirms these relative ages and gives us fairly precise absolute ages for fossils. Absolute ages uses radiometric dating using half-lives of isotopes to give us an actual number age for fossils. So an example of a relative age would be that fossil A is older than fossil C, while an example of an absolute age would be that fossil A is 10 million years old. So relative ages are kind of like putting things in sequence. This happened first, second, third, or this is older or younger, while absolute ages assigns an actual number age to it. Based on the layering of rocks and fossils, geologists can divide Earth's 412 billion year history into a set of distinct intervals that make up what we call the geologic timescale. The geologic timescale is a timescale that's used by scientists to describe major eras in Earth's past. Typically, these intervals have names along the timeline, and they're typically associated with some kind of major event. So you might wonder why the geological timescale can show us a lot more detail for the last few hundred million years than it does for earlier times. If we go back and look at kind of a relative example, we have a lot more data in our recent past than we do for a lot earlier times. And the answer is that fossils become increasingly difficult to find as we look deeper into Earth's history for three major reasons. First, older rocks are much rarer than younger rocks because most of Earth's surface is geologically young. Second, even when we find very old rocks, they often have been subject to transformations caused by heat and pressure that would have destroyed any fossil evidence that they contained. And third, nearly all life prior to a few hundred million years ago was microscopic, which means they're so small that we couldn't see them with the naked eye, and microscopic fossils are much more difficult to identify. So here's an example of fossils in sedimentary rock. The rock layers of the Grand Canyon record 500 million years of Earth's history. And here's an example of fossils. Here's dinosaur fossils from the Dinosaur National Monument in the western United States. Geologists have found a few very old rocks that suggest that life was already thriving on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, and possibly for hundreds of millions of years before that. One strong line of evidence comes from rocks called stromatolites. Stromatolites are similar in size, shape, and interior structure to sections of modern-day mat-shaped formations that we call living stromatolites. Living stromatolites are formed by colonies of microbes, and they contain layers of sediment intermixed with microbes of different species. Microbes near the top generate energy through photosynthesis, and those beneath get their energy from carbon compounds left as waste products from the photosynthetic microbes. The living stromatolites grow in size as sediments are deposited over them, forcing the microbes to migrate upward in order to remain at the depths that they're adapted to. This gradual migration creates layered structures. The similarity of structures between the ancient stromatolites and the living stromatolites suggests a similar origin, implying that stromatolites are fossil remnants of early life on Earth. Another line of evidence is based on the study of carbon isotopes, and that may point to the existence of life even further back in time. Carbon has two stable isotopes. Carbon-12, that has 6 protons and 6 neutrons in its nucleus, and then there's carbon-13, that has 6 protons and 1 extra neutron. Living organisms incorporate carbon-12 more easily than carbon-13. As a result, the fraction of carbon-13 is always a bit lower in living organisms and fossils than in rock samples that lack fossils. All life in fossils tested to date show the same characteristic ratio of these two carbon isotopes. This ratio has been found in at least 2 of the world's oldest rock formations. One formation found on the island of Aquilanar in Greenland has carbon isotopes indicative of life in rocks dating to more than 3.85 billion years ago. Another in Labrador, Canada, has such ratio rocks that are about 100 million years older, or about 3.95 billion years old. So the oldest fossils that show bacteria-like organisms were present over 3.5 billion years ago, and the carbon isotope evidence dates the origin of life to more than 3.85 billion years ago. So here's another look at our geological timescale. So you can see right here we have that carbon isotope evidence of life, which we said was about 3.85 million years ago. If you ever see MYA or BYA, that means million or billions of years ago. And we see our oldest stromatolites and microfossils at about 3.5 billion years ago. So we're starting to see kind of how quickly that happened after Earth formed. When we see the geological timescale, a lot of times it's not horizontal, but it's vertical, starting with today and going back in time, just in case you've ever seen it that way. Now we're going to look into the question, how did life arise on Earth? Well, the early origin of life is suggestive of the idea that life arose early. But we would be more confident of this idea if we could learn how life arose on Earth. Scientists explore this question primarily by learning about how life has evolved over time, which tells us what early life may have looked like, and then by doing lab experiments to learn how life might have started. So we see how life has evolved through time by looking at the fact that all life on Earth actually shares a common ancestry. And we might never know exactly how the first organism rose on Earth, but lab experiments tell us a couple scenarios that are possible. And this is going to lead us into talking about the theory of evolution. The fossil record clearly shows that life has gone through great changes over time. If we can understand how life arose, then we need to understand what causes these changes so we can trace life back to its origin. The unifying theory through which scientists understand life on Earth is the theory of evolution that was first published by Charles Darwin in 1859. The theory of evolution is the scientific theory that explains how evolution occurs through the process of natural selection. Evolution simply just means change with time. Other scientists had already recognized evidence for evolution in the fossil record, but nobody before Darwin could successfully explain how species might be able to undergo change. In essence, the fossil record provides strong evidence that evolution has occurred, while Darwin's theory of evolution explains how it actually occurs. Darwin's theory tells us about how evolution occurs through natural selection, which is simply the idea that genetic traits that provide a reproductive advantage will naturally win out or be selected over the less advantageous traits. So he showed us that natural selection is the primary mechanism of evolution because it explains how species can change over time as traits that improve adaptation to a local environment are passed down through different generations. If enough small individual variations accumulate, natural selection can actually give rise to an entirely new species. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection tells us that species adapt and change by passing hereditary traits from one generation to the next. In essence, his theory predicted that there must be some mechanism for heredity that would preserve most hereditary information from prior generations, but still allow for small changes. Today we know that this mechanism is embodied in the properties of the molecule called DNA, which is short for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is the molecule that constitutes the genetic material of life on Earth. In that sense, the discovery of DNA was a tremendous predictive success for Darwin's theory. Living organisms reproduce by copying DNA and passing these copies on to their descendants. A molecule of DNA consists of two long strands, somewhat like the interlocking strands of a zipper, and they're wound together in a spiral shape known as the double helix. So each one of these pieces is a strand, and they get wound together into a shape that we call the double helix. So this whole shape here is the double helix making up DNA. The instructions for assembling a living organism are written in the precise order of 4 chemical bases that are abbreviated A, T, C, and G. And these letters are chosen because they're the first letters of their chemical names that make up the interlocking portions of the DNA zipper. These bases pair up in a way that ensures that both strands of a DNA molecule contain the same genetic information. By unwinding and allowing new strands to form alongside the original ones, a single DNA molecule can give rise to 2 identical copies of itself. And that's how our genetic material actually gets copied and passed on to future generations. Evolution occurs because the transfer of genetic information from one generation to the next is not always perfect. An organism's DNA may occasionally be altered by copying errors or by an external influence, like ultraviolet light from the sun or exposure to toxic or radioactive chemicals. Any change in an organism's DNA is called a mutation. A mutation is often errors in the copying process when DNA replicates itself. Many mutations are lethal, killing the cell in which the mutation occurs. However, some may actually improve a cell's ability to survive and reproduce, allowing the cell to pass this improvement on to its offspring. Our understanding of the molecular mechanism of natural selection has put the theory of evolution on a stronger foundation than ever before. Biologists routinely witness evolution occurring before their eyes among laboratory microorganisms, or over periods of just a few decades among plants and animals that are subject to environmental stress. Moreover, the theory of evolution has become the underpinning of virtually all modern biology, medicine, and agriculture. For example, agricultural scientists apply the idea of natural selection to help develop pest control strategies that reduce the populations of harmful insects without harming the populations of beneficial ones. Medical researchers test new drugs on animals that are genetically similar to humans because the theory of evolution tells us that genetically similar species should have somewhat similar physiological responses. And biologists study the genetic relationships between organisms by comparing their DNA. The basic chemical nature of DNA is virtually identical among all living organisms. This fact, along with other biochemical similarities that are shared by all living organisms, tells us that all life on Earth today can trace its origins to a common ancestor that lived a long time ago. We are unlikely to find fossils of the earliest organisms, but we can learn about early life through careful studies of the DNA of living organisms. Biologists can determine the evolutionary relationships among living species by comparing the sequences of bases in their DNA. For example, two organisms whose DNA sequences differ in 5 places for a particular gene are more distantly related than organisms whose gene sequences differ in only 1 place. Many DNA comparisons suggest that all living organisms are related in a way that's depicted schematically by the tree of life figure that you see on your slide here. Although details on the structure of this tree remain uncertain, it indicates that life on Earth is divided into 3 major groupings or domains that we call bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And these are the 3 domains of life. Notice that plants and animals represent only 2 tiny branches of the domain eukarya. Organisms on branches located closer to the root of the tree of life must contain DNA that is evolutionary older, suggesting that they're more closely resembling organisms that lived early in Earth's history. So the further down you are on this tree of life, they're older. The closer to the top are younger. So you see plants and animals are quite young compared to some of the other species that we see on this tree of life. Some of the modern day organisms that appear to be evolutionarily the oldest are microbes that live in very hot water around seafloor volcanic vents. Unlike most life at Earth's surface, which depends on sunlight, these organisms get energy from chemical reactions in the hot, mineral-rich water around these volcanic vents. The idea that early organisms might have lived in such extreme conditions might be surprising to you at first, but it actually makes sense when we think about it. The deep ocean environment would have been protected from harmful ultraviolet radiation that was bathing Earth's surface before our atmosphere had oxygen or an ozone layer. It also may have offered them protection from the effects of impacts during heavy bombardment. Moreover, the chemical pathways that are used to extract energy from the mineral-rich hot water are simpler than other chemical pathways like photosynthesis that's used by living organisms to get energy. For these reasons, many scientists suspect that life arose near these deep sea vents or in similar environments that provided chemical energy. This specific deep sea vent here is called a black smoker because it produces water that comes out of these vents that's black in color due to the presence of heavy minerals. So what we're seeing here is that the earliest life on Earth may have resembled bacteria that we find today near these deep ocean volcanic vents. The theory of evolution explains how the earliest organisms evolved into the great diversity of life that we have on Earth today. But where did the first organisms exactly come from? We may never know for sure because we're unlikely to find fossils that show us the transition from non-life to life on Earth. However, over the past several decades, scientists have conducted lab experiments that are designed to mimic the conditions that existed on a young Earth. These experiments suggest that life could have arisen through natural chemical reactions. Experiments like this were first performed in the 1950s, and they have been refined and improved since that time. In essence, experiments mix chemicals thought to have been present on the early Earth, and then spark the chemicals with electricity to simulate lightning or other energy sources. The chemical reactions that follow have produced nearly all the major molecules of life, including amino acids and the DNA bases. Many of these molecules are also found in meteorites, suggesting that some of the building blocks of life may have actually arrived from space. An example of this is the Miller-Urey experiment that actually showed us these building blocks of life and how they form easily and spontaneously under the early Earth conditions. More recent lab experiments have shown that naturally occurring clays, which should have been abundant in the early oceans, can catalyze the formation of short strands of RNA. RNA is a molecule that's like one single strand of DNA. Some of these short RNA molecules can in turn catalyze other reactions. These same clay minerals can also lead to the formation of microscopic enclosed membranes that are often called pre-cells because of their resemblance to living cells, and sometimes RNA was even found inside of them. Because some RNA molecules are capable of self-replication, we can envision the process summarized in this picture here. First, we see naturally formed chemical building blocks were catalyzed by clay to make self-replicating RNA molecules, some of which became enclosed in microscopic pre-cells. Pre-cells in which RNA replicated faster and more accurately were more likely to spread, leading to a type of positive feedback that would have encouraged even faster and even more accurate replication. With these types of chemical reactions occurring all over Earth, it may have been only a matter of time until some of the pre-cells turned into RNA-based life, which eventually evolved into DNA-based life. We may never know whether life really arose in this way or not, but unless we're missing some major piece of the puzzle, it seems plausible that life started easily through a natural sequence of chemical processes, where the clay minerals catalyzed the production of RNA in membranes that formed pre-cells. Then molecular natural selection favored efficient, self-replicating RNA molecules. True living cells with the RNA genome gave rise to kind of a world dominated by RNA organisms. And then DNA evolved from RNA and biological evolution was able to continue. Another question we could ask about life on Earth is, did life actually migrate to Earth? Our scenario suggests that life could have arisen naturally here on Earth, but an alternative possibility is that life arose elsewhere, perhaps maybe on Venus or Mars, and then migrated to Earth on meteorites. Calculations suggest that Venus, Earth, and Mars all should have exchanged many tons of rock, especially in the early days of the solar system, when impacts were common. The presence of complex carbon compounds in meteorites and comets tells us that the building blocks of life can survive in space, and tests have shown that some microbes can actually survive in space for many years. We're now ready to take a quick look at the history of life on Earth, summarized in the geological timeline. Earth formed 4.4 billion years ago, and the giant impact thought to have formed the moon probably happened shortly after that. Mineral evidence suggests that Earth had oceans by about 4.3 billion years ago, and those early oceans would have been natural laboratories for chemical reactions that could have led to life. If life formed very early, it may have been disrupted by the period of heavy bombardment. But once life took hold, evolution was rapidly able to diversify it. Despite the rapid pace of evolution, the most complex organisms remained single-celled for at least 1 billion years after life first arose. All of these organisms probably lived in the oceans because the lack of a protective ozone layer made land inhospitable. Things began to change only when oxygen started to build up in Earth's atmosphere. Nearly all of the oxygen in our atmosphere was originally released through photosynthesis by single-celled organisms known as cyanobacteria. Fossil evidence indicates that cyanobacteria were producing oxygen through photosynthesis at least 2.7 billion years ago and possibly for hundreds of million years before that. However, oxygen didn't immediately begin to accumulate in the atmosphere. For hundreds of millions of years, chemical reactions with surface rocks pulled the oxygen back out of the atmosphere nearly as fast as the cyanobacteria could produce it. But these tiny organisms were abundant and persistent, and eventually the surface rock was so saturated with oxygen that the rate of oxygen removal slowed down. Oxygen then began to accumulate in the atmosphere, though it might not have reached a level that we could have breathed until a few 100 million years ago. So oxygen finally began to build up in the atmosphere 2 billion years ago. Since then, we've seen kind of this explosion of life, going from organisms in the land to organisms in the sea, to organisms on land like dinosaurs and mammals, to our earliest form of humans. So the cyanobacteria really paved the way for more complicated life forms on Earth by releasing oxygen into the atmosphere via photosynthesis. So what conditions are necessary for life? Our understanding of the timing and possible origins of life on Earth suggests that life might similarly arise on other worlds, but this would only be the case if they contain the necessities of life. So now we need to ask ourselves, what are the necessities of life? While it's possible that life on other worlds could be quite different from life on Earth, it's easiest to begin the search for life by looking for conditions that organisms on Earth could live. If we compare all the different forms of life on Earth, we find that life as a whole has only 3 basic requirements. 1, a source of nutrients. Typically, that's atoms and molecules that build living cells. Second, they need energy to fuel the activities of life. This energy can be from sunlight, chemical reactions, or even the heat of Earth itself. And the third necessity of life is liquid water. And liquid water is the hardest one to find on other planets. These 3 requirements give us a basic roadmap for the search of life elsewhere. If we want to find life on other worlds, it makes sense to start searching for worlds that offer these 3 basic necessities. What's interesting is only the 3rd requirement, liquid water, seems to pose much of a constraint. Liquid water is actually relatively rare. Therefore, the search for liquid water, or the possibility a liquid of some other type exists, is what is driving the current search for life in our universe. So in this first section, we learned that life arose on Earth at least 3.85 billion years ago, shortly after the end of a heavy bombardment. Life on Earth evolved from a common organism through natural selection, but we don't yet know the origin of that first organism. And we also learned that the 3 things that are necessary for life are nutrients, energy, and liquid water. Now in this second section, we're going to look at life in the solar system. The liquid water requirement rules out most of the worlds in our solar system as possible homes for life. Mercury and the Moon are barren and dry. Venus is too hot to have liquid water on its surface. And most of the small bodies of the outer solar system are too cold. The Jovian planets may have droplets of liquid water in some of their clouds, but the strong vertical winds on these planets means the droplets can't stay liquid for long, making these planets unlikely homes for life. Nevertheless, several worlds do show evidence of liquid water or some other liquid mixture that seems to offer at least some possibility of life. The most notable are Mars and a few of the Jovian moons, especially Jupiter's moon, Europa. In this section, we're going to consider the possibility of extraterrestrial life in our own solar system. So we're going to look at, could there be life on Mars? And could there be life in the outer solar system? We're going to start with the question, could there be life on Mars? When we search for worlds that have the necessities of life as we know them from life on Earth, we're looking for what we call a habitable world. A habitable world is a world with environmental conditions under which life could potentially arise or survive. In other words, a habitable world is one that has all of the necessities of life. So it's one where environmental conditions exist could allow life arise or survive. Mars seems to have fit the bill for habitability in the past because there's strong evidence that indicates that liquid water flowed on Mars during its early history. Although Mars lacks surface liquid water today, it still has an abundant water ice both on its surface and underground. So it has this kind of subsurface ice and briny water. Therefore, it seems likely that at least some pockets of liquid water might still exist underground, particularly near sources of volcanic heat. Indeed, evidence has recently been found for at least one likely subterranean lake on Mars near the South Polar ice cap, giving a further push to the idea that if life ever got started on Mars, it might still survive in places where underground water exists today. The most direct way to search for life on Mars is by looking for it with landings and rovers. Unfortunately, a direct search turned out to be more difficult than we first imagined. This was a lesson we learned from the 2 Viking landers that reached Mars in 1976. These Viking landers had arms to scoop up soil samples, and there were several onboard experiments that looked for evidence that nutrients were being taken up by microscopic organisms in the soil. They did see some of this, however, scientists later realized that the results could be explained by chemical reactions that would occur in the conditions on Mars. A less direct way to investigate the possibility of life on Mars is to look at atmospheric gases that might provide clues. Scientists are particularly intrigued by the detection of methane in the Mars atmosphere. Atmospheric methane is quickly destroyed by ultraviolet light from the sun, so its presence implies that it's being continually released from the surface of Mars. The Curiosity rover landed on Mars in 2012, and it has instruments that allow it to occasionally collect small samples of the air on Mars. Then it studies that air spectroscopically as it shines a laser light through the sample. The Curiosity rover has done this more than 30 times as of 2018, and it usually measures an atmospheric methane concentration between 0.4 and 0.7 parts per billion. Occasionally, it spikes to as high as 7 parts per billion. While these concentrations are very low, for comparison, Earth's atmospheric methane is about 1,800 parts per billion. They still suggest there's some kind of ongoing source of methane release. And these variations measured by the Curiosity rover appear to track with the seasons on Mars. An Earth-based observation suggests that the methane concentration sometimes has higher spikes than the Curiosity has detected, with one spike reaching about 45 parts per billion. What about the outer solar system? Is there life there? Well, beyond Mars, the cold temperatures of the outer solar system make it unlikely that we could ever find surface liquid water. However, as we discuss in chapters 11 and 12, numerous worlds may have subsurface lakes or oceans of liquid water, and at least one world, Saturn's moon Titan, has surface lakes of ethane and methane. Remember that 3 of Jupiter's moons show evidence of having subsurface oceans. These are Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. The ice and rock from which Europa formed undoubtedly included the chemical ingredients necessary for life, and Europa's internal heating is strong enough to power volcanic vents on its seafloor. If we are correct in guessing that life on Earth may have arisen near undersea volcanic vents, then Europa would seem to have everything needed for life to originate there. Indeed, Europa is such a promising candidate for life that while some scientists ask what are the odds that life could arise on a strange world like Europa, others are asking what are the chances that all the necessities for life could be available together for 4.5 billion years without life happening. The possibility of life on Europa is especially interesting because given the enormous depth of the suspected ocean, it could, in principle, include very large creatures. However, the potential energy sources for life on Europa are far more limited than the energy sources for life on Earth, mainly because Sunlight could not fuel photosynthesis in the subsurface ocean on Europa. As a result, most scientists expect that any life that might exist on Europa would probably be microscopic and primitive. Energy considerations also explain why scientists consider life to be less likely on Ganymede and Callisto, because these moons would have had even less energy for life in their subsurface oceans than Europa does. Searching for life on Europa will probably be difficult since the ocean is buried beneath several kilometers of ice. However, as we discussed back in Chapter 11, the study of Europa's icy surface indicates that at least some water occasionally wells up from below and freezes. So it is possible that we could find frozen microbes or other evidence of life through surface spectroscopy from an orbiting spacecraft or direct sampling of the surface by a lander. There's also evidence that water or gas is sometimes vented into space. So orbiting probes could search for the evidence of life by sampling that gas. More ambitiously, some scientists are considering the possibility of someday sending a robotic submarine that would melt its way through the ice to search for life in the ocean below. Saturn's moons Titan and Enceladus are both considered promising candidates for life as well. Remember that Titan's surface is too cold for liquid water, but it does have lakes of liquid ethane and methane on its surface. Although biologists think it's unlikely, it is possible that this liquid could support life as water does on Earth. There are also slim prospects for water-based life on Titan. The ultraviolet light that hits Titan's atmosphere produces a wide range of carbon compounds that, over billions of years, should have accumulated as a deep layer of sediment on the surface. These sediments may be the material in the dunes that we find on Titan. Occasional impacts by comets or asteroids would be able to provide enough heat locally to melt any water ice and create pockets of warm water that might persist for 1,000 years or so, offering at least some interesting organic chemistry, if not the development of life. Enceladus seems at least equally promising, since evidence that we discuss in Chapter 11 also supports the idea that it has a global subsurface ocean. Moreover, Enceladus has these ice fountains that presumably spray out material from this ocean, which becomes frozen as it emerges. This offers the possibility that if the ocean contains life, the ice fountains might spray out flash-frozen life forms. For this reason, scientists hope to send a mission that could sample the ice spray in search of life on Enceladus. The Cassini mission flew through the ice fountains, but was not equipped with instruments to sample the ice, since the existence of the fountains was not known when Cassini was actually built. So in this section, we discussed how there is evidence for liquid water in the past on Mars that suggests that life was once possible on Mars. When we looked at the outer solar system, there are some Jovian moons that are cold, but actually show evidence for subsurface water and other liquids. We don't know yet whether any other world in our solar system besides Earth has ever been home to life, but it's becoming increasingly clear that there are numerous places that are worth searching for the evidence of life in our solar system. Now we're going to talk about the life around other stars. Studies of extrasolar planets suggest that our galaxy contains billions of planetary systems. So the prospects for life elsewhere might seem pretty good, but numbers alone don't tell the whole story. In this section, we're going to consider the prospects for life on worlds orbiting other stars. So we're going to discuss the requirements for surface habitability, what kinds of extrasolar worlds might be habitable, and how we can detect life on extrasolar planets. First, we need to look at the requirements for surface habitability. When we consider the search for life beyond our solar system, we need to distinguish between surface life, like that exists on Earth, and subsurface life, like what we envision as a possibility on Mars or Europa. While large telescopes could, in principle, allow us to discover surface life on extrasolar planets, no foreseeable technology will allow us to find life that's hidden deep underground in other star systems. Therefore, we need to begin our consideration of extrasolar life by focusing on the search for planets with habitable surfaces. When we talk about a habitable surface, that means a surface with both temperatures and pressures that could allow liquid water to exist. So when we talk about habitable, we mean habitable as the potential for life, not actually that it has life itself. A habitable world contains the basic necessities for life as we know it, including liquid water. It doesn't mean that it necessarily has life. Soon we might be able to search for worlds with habitable surfaces around other stars. We won't be able to look for worlds like Europa and that kind of subsurface, even though those might be more common. Our first question in our search for habitable worlds is how many stars could be home to life? So we do have some constraints on star systems that could be home to life. First, the star system needs to be old enough to allow time for evolution. So this typically rules out our high mass stars since we said their lifetimes are so short. Second, they need to have stable orbits. So this can rule out kind of binary or multiple star systems. Third, we need to look at the size of the habitable zone. The habitable zone is a region in which a planet of the right size could have liquid water on its surface. But remember, surface life isn't the only possibility. That's just the easiest possibility for us to explore. Even with these constraints, there are billions of stars in the Milky Way that could potentially have habitable zones. The more massive the star is, the larger its habitable zone is, and the higher probability there is that a planet exists in that zone. Even if we focus on only G-type stars like our sun, there's billions of those in the Milky Way galaxy alone, so we can't rule out habitable worlds around smaller stars too. More massive stars, we said, their lifetimes are too short for evolution. So in this image, we're looking at habitable zones, which are the regions around a star in which planets could have surface temperatures at which liquid water could exist. So you see how when the star gets smaller, the habitable zone gets smaller, so there's a smaller probability of a planet existing in that zone. Our technology is not yet good enough for us to determine whether extrasolar planets have habitable surfaces. But we can make some educated guesses if we know the requirements for long-term surface habitability. If we think back on all the ideas we've discussed this semester, we find that there are 4 major factors that have made Earth so hospitable to the long-term evolution of life. First, we have to look at where Earth is in the habitable zone. The Earth is the right distance from the sun to allow water vapor to condense as rain and make oceans, but not too far that all of the water freezes. So Earth has that kind of Goldilocks situation, not too close, not too far. It's in the just right position to maintain liquid water. Second, Earth has volcanism that releases trapped gases from the interior of Earth, including water vapor and carbon dioxide that makes up our atmospheres and our oceans. Third, Earth has plate tectonics that supports a climate-regulating carbon dioxide cycle. And fourth, Earth has a planetary magnetic field that protects the atmosphere from the solar wind. So now we can start to answer what kinds of extrasolar worlds might be habitable. One of the key lessons we've learned in the study of extrasolar planets is that the planets come in a wider range of types than we find in our own solar system. This fact makes scientists wonder if habitability might also be broader when we consider the extrasolar worlds. So here we're going to explore a few intriguing possibilities. The standard way of calculating habitable zones assumes rocky planets like Venus, Earth, and Mars are warmed by the greenhouse effect of water vapor and carbon dioxide in their atmospheres. But it is possible that other types of worlds might have habitable surfaces over a broader zone. Some scientists suspect that this might indeed be the case for worlds that are somewhat larger than Earth, such as super-Earths and water worlds. Because these planets can be several times as massive as Earth, Their atmospheres might retain substantial amounts of hydrogen gas captured from a solar nebula during the planet's formation. Hydrogen can also act as a greenhouse gas, which means it could keep these planets warm enough to maintain surface liquid water well beyond the boundaries that are usually assumed for habitable zones. We also have to consider the concept of subsurface habitability, which we've already started to discuss a little bit in this chapter. And just as we've found in our own solar system, where we've identified Mars and several Jovian moons as possibly having suitable subsurface regions, it's possible that there could be far more worlds with subsurface rather than surface habitabilities. And lastly, we could consider orphan planets. So this is kind of another category of planet habitable worlds that we have not yet discussed, and these are called orphan planets. Sometimes these are called rogue planets as well. So these are planets that do not orbit a star. The bottom line is that we have a wide range of possibilities. Overall, there seems to be great potential for habitability throughout the universe, both on planets that might be Earth-like in character and appearance, and also on a variety of worlds that might have other forms of habitability. Moreover, we focus primarily on habitability by life that uses water as its liquid medium, but the case of Titan makes us wonder whether other liquids might also be used. Of course, being habitable doesn't necessarily mean it has life. So now we're going to turn our attention to the question of how we might actually discover life beyond the solar system. So we want to know and answer the question here, how could we detect life on extrasolar planets? Presently, we have no way to search for actual life on any of the many extrasolar worlds that might be potentially habitable. None of our indirect methods for learning about these worlds can offer information that would tell us whether they have life, and our direct detection capabilities remain too rudimentary to actually detect the presence of life. However, we expect our direct observational capabilities to improve dramatically in the coming decades, and as a result, scientists are working on strategies that might allow future telescopes to search for life on worlds around other stars. If our telescope technology becomes sufficiently powerful, we can hope to learn about potential life through both images and spectra. For example, large telescopes in space may be able to attain images with high enough resolution to tell us whether extrasolar planets have continents and oceans, and perhaps even allow us to monitor seasonal changes. And spectra could prove to be even more useful. Moderate resolution infrared spectra can reveal the abundance of many atmospheric gases, and careful analysis of the atmospheric makeup might tell us whether a planet has life. On Earth, for example, the large abundance of oxygen in our atmosphere is a direct result of photosynthetic life. Abundant oxygen in the atmosphere of another world might similarly indicate the presence of life. Other evidence might come from any ratio of atmospheric gases that would naturally change unless it was being actively maintained by the respiration of living organisms. Although we can't do this yet, it seems likely that within a few decades, we'll have methods for learning whether distant planets have life or not. In this section, we talked about the requirements for surface habitability. Being the right distance from a star might actually be all that's needed, meaning that billions of planets in our galaxy might fit the bill. And we're seeing that extrasolar worlds might be habitable. A much larger variety than just the Earth-like planets actually exist in habitable zones. And the way we can learn about life on extrasolar planets is by analyzing atmospheric gases that might give us clues about whether life exists on these planets or not. Now we're going to turn our attention to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. If life turns out to be common, it's natural for us to wonder whether other worlds might also have intelligent life and civilizations. If such civilizations exist, we might be able to find them simply by listening for signals that they're sending into interstellar space, either in deliberate attempts to contact other civilizations or as a means of communicating among themselves. The search for signals from other civilizations is generally known as the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI for short. So SETI stands for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and that's what we're going to talk about in this section. We're going to answer the questions, how many civilizations are out there, and how does the search for extraterrestrial intelligence work? So first we want to answer the question, how many civilizations are out there? SETI efforts have a chance to succeed only if other advanced civilizations are broadcasting signals that we can receive. To judge the chances of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence success, we need to know how many civilizations are broadcasting signals right now. Given that we don't even know whether microbial life exists anywhere beyond Earth, we definitely don't know whether other civilizations exist, let alone how many there might be. Nevertheless, for the purposes of planning a search for extraterrestrial intelligence, it's useful to have an organized way of thinking about the number of civilizations that might be out there. To keep our discussion simple, we're only going to consider the number of potential civilizations in our own galaxy. We can always extend our estimate to the rest of the universe by multiplying the result we find for our galaxy by 100 billion, which is the approximate number of galaxies in the observable universe. In 1961, astronomer Frank Drake wrote a simple equation now known as the Drake equation. This was designed to summarize the factors that will determine the number of civilizations that currently share the Milky Way galaxy with us, and that are capable of interstellar communication. In a form slightly modified from the original equation, the Drake equation looks like what's written here on your slide. So this equation is going to make sense once we understand the meaning of each factor. So the Drake equation equals NHP times F life times F civ times F now. NHP is the number of habitable planets in the galaxy. So this is the number of planets that could potentially have life. F life is the fraction of habitable planets that actually have life. For example, an F life of 1 would mean that all habitable planets have life. An F life of 1 million would mean that only 1 in a million habitable planets has life. Therefore, the product NHP times F life tells us the number of life-bearing planets in the galaxy. Then we have F civ. This is the fraction of life-bearing planets on which a civilization capable of interstellar communication has at some time arisen. For example, F civ of 1,000 would mean that a civilization has existed on 1 out of 1,000 planets with life, while the other 999 out of that 1,000 have not had a species that has learned to build radio transmitters, lasers, or other devices for interstellar conversation. When we multiply this factor by the first two, we have NHP times F life times F civ. We're getting the total number of planets on which intelligent beings have evolved and developed a communicating civilization sometime in the galaxy's history. Then we have F now. That's the fraction of these civilization-bearing planets that happen to have a civilization right now, as opposed to millions or billions of years in the past. This factor is really important because we can hope to contact only civilizations that are broadcasting signals that we could receive right now in the present time. In estimating F now, we assume that the light travel time for signals from other stars has to be taken into account. Together, this equation gives us the number of civilizations that we could potentially communicate with. Because the product of the first three factors tells us the total number of civilizations that have ever arisen in the galaxy, multiplying by F now tells us how many we could make contact with today. In other words, the result of the Drake equation should, in principle, tell us the number of civilizations that we might hope to contact. Unfortunately, we can make a reasonable estimate only for the first term, NHP, in the Drake equation, which means we can't actually calculate the result. Nevertheless, the equation is a really useful way of organizing our thinking, as we can see by considering the potential values for each one of its factors. So NHP, which is the number of habitable planets in the galaxy, is probably in the billions. F life, which is the fraction of habitable planets that have life, is probably near 0 or 1. F civ is the fraction of life-bearing planets on which a civilization capable of communication at some time is probably about 4 billion years. And F now, well, that really depends on whether civilizations can survive long-term or not. So we don't really know the values, but we could look at the potential values to help us kind of organize our way of thinking. One interesting question is whether it's likely or unlikely that a planet with life would ever get a species as smart as us. So this actually can help us kind of see things both ways. On one hand, we're looking at kind of brain size here. Humans have much larger brains in proportion to body mass than any other species that has ever lived on Earth. And we are kind of this outlier, but some of that is expected. So this kind of brings us to the question of intelligence. Even if life-bearing planets are very common, civilizations capable of interstellar communication might not be. The fraction of life-bearing planets that at some time have had such civilizations depends on at least two things. First, a planet would have to have a species evolve with a sufficient intelligence to develop interstellar communication. In other words, the planet needs a species at least as smart as we are. Second, that species would have to develop a civilization with technology at least as advanced as ours. Considering our level of intelligence in comparison to that of other animals on Earth, we can get a rough measure of intelligence by comparing brain mass to total body mass. So this figure on the slide here shows us the brain weights for a sampling of birds and mammals plotted against their body weights. There's a clear and expected trend in that heavier animals have heavier brains. By drawing a straight line that fits this data, we can define an average value of brain mass for each body mass. Animals whose brain mass falls above the line are smarter than average, while those whose brain mass falls below the line are mentally less agile. If we look closely, you'll see that the data point for humans lies farther above the line than the data point for any other species. By this measure of intelligence, we are far smarter than any other species that have ever existed on Earth. So if there's other civilizations out there, then in principle, we should be able to make contact with them. Based on our current understanding of physics, it seems likely that even very advanced civilizations would communicate as much as we do by encoding signals in radio waves or other forms of light. To search for alien radio signals, most SETI researchers use large radio telescopes, such as the Allen Array telescope seen in this picture. A few researchers are studying other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. For example, some scientists use visible light telescopes to search for communications encoded as laser pulses. Of course, advanced civilizations may have well-invented communication technologies that we can't even imagine or let alone detect. SETI experiments will look for deliberate signals from extraterrestrials. Current SETI efforts could not detect signals as weak as our own radio or TV broadcasts for now. We're really looking for a deliberately broadcast signal for other forms of life trying to communicate with us. In fact, we've even sent out a few signals ourselves. There was a message sent from Arecibo in 1974 that made it a distance of approximately 21,000 light years. To date, us humans have only made a few attempts to broadcast our existence in this way. The most famous was this 3-minute transition that we made in 1974 with a planetary radar transmitter on the Arecibo radio telescope, in which a simple pictorial message was beamed toward the globular cluster M13. This target was chosen in part because it contains a few 100,000 stars, seemingly offering a good chance that it has at least one civilization around it. However, M13 is about 25,000 light years from Earth, so it'll take 25,000 years for our signal to get there, and another 25,000 years for any response to make its way back to Earth. Several SETI projects underway or in development would be capable of detecting signals like the one that we broadcast from Arecibo if they came from civilizations within a few hundred light years. These SETI efforts scan millions of radio frequency bands simultaneously. If anybody nearby is deliberately broadcasting on an ongoing basis, we have a pretty good chance of detecting those signals. In this section, we learn that we really don't know how many civilizations are out there, but the Drake equation gives us a framework for thinking about that. And that some telescopes are currently looking for deliberate communications from other worlds. In the last section of this chapter, we're going to now turn our attention to interstellar travel and its implications for civilization. So far, we've discussed ways of detecting distant civilizations without leaving the comfort of our own planet. The question now is, could we ever actually visit other worlds in another star system? A careful analysis of this question turns out to have profound implications for the future of our civilization. To see why, we need to consider the prospects for achieving interstellar travel. So we're going to answer the questions, how difficult is interstellar travel, and where are the aliens? So first we need to examine spacecraft when we're talking about the challenge of interstellar travel. We've launched 5 spacecraft that will leave our solar system and eventually travel among the stars. The planetary probes Pioneer 10, Pioneer 11, Voyager 1, Voyager 2, and New Horizons. These spacecraft are traveling about as fast as anything ever built by humans, but their speeds are still less than 110,000th of the speed of light. It would take each of them some 100,000 years just to reach the next nearest star system, Alpha Centauri. But their trajectories won't actually take them anywhere near it. Instead, they're going to simply continue their journey without passing close to any nearby stars, wandering the Milky Way for millions or even billions of years to come. The Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft carry greetings from Earth, just in case someone comes across one of them someday. If we want to make interstellar journeys within human lifetimes, we're going to need spaceships that can travel at speeds close to the speed of light. We're going to need entirely new types of engines on our spacecraft in order to reach these high speeds. The energy requirements of interstellar spacecraft pose a big challenge. In addition to being a fast-moving spacecraft, we need new types of shielding to protect the crew members from instant death. As a spacecraft travels through interstellar gas near the speed of light, ordinary atoms and ions are going to hit it like a deadly flood of high-energy cosmic rays. If we can succeed in building spacecraft capable of traveling at speeds close to the speed of light, the crews on them are going to face significant social challenges. According to the well-tested principles of Einstein's theory of relativity, time is going to run much more slowly on a spacecraft that travels at high speed to the stars than it does here on Earth. For example, in a spacecraft traveling at an average speed of 99.9% the speed of light, the 50 light-year round trip to the star Vega would take the travelers only about 2 years, but more than 50 years would pass on Earth while they were gone. So the crew would only need 2 years worth of provisions and would only age 2 years during the voyage, but they'd return to a world quite different from the one they left. Their family and friends would be older or deceased, new technologies might have made their knowledge and skills obsolete, and many political and social challenges might have also occurred in their absence. So the crew would face a difficult adjustment when they came back home to Earth, because even though they were only aged 2 years, life on Earth had aged 50. So interstellar travel is difficult. We need spaceships with more efficient engines. The energy requirements for that are enormous. Traveling that fast at the speed of light, normal particles become more like cosmic rays, so we need to be able to shield the spacecraft from them. And we have to deal with the fact that time is going to travel more slowly for those traveling that quickly, so there's social complications when they return to Earth. Now we're going to look for, well, where are the aliens? Imagine that we actually survive long enough to become interstellar travelers, and that we begin to colonize habitable planets around nearby stars. As each colony grows, it may send out explorers to other star systems. Even if our starships traveled at relatively low speeds, say a few percentages off of the speed of light, we could have dozens of outposts around nearby stars within a few centuries. In 10,000 years, our descendants would be spread among stars within a few hundred light years of Earth. In a few million years, we could have outposts throughout the Milky Way galaxy, and we would have become a true galactic civilization. Now, if we take the idea that we could develop a galactic civilization within a few million years and combine it with the reasonable idea that civilizations ought to be common, we're led to an astonishing conclusion. Someone else should have already created a galactic civilization. To see why, we could look at some sample numbers. Suppose the overall odds of a civilization arising around a star are about the same as our odds of winning the lottery, or 1 in a million. Using a low estimate of 100 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, this would mean some 100,000 civilizations would exist in our galaxy alone. Current evidence suggests that stars and planetary systems like our own could have formed for at least 5 billion years before our solar system was even born. In which case, the first of these 100,000 civilizations would have arisen at least 5 billion years ago. Others would have arisen on average about every 50,000 years. Under these assumptions, we would expect the youngest civilization besides ours to be some 50,000 years ahead of us technologically, and most would be millions or even billions of years ahead of us. We then encounter a strange paradox. Plausible arguments suggest that a galactic civilization should have already existed, yet we have so far found no evidence for such a civilization. This paradox is often called Fermi's paradox after the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Enrico Fermi. During a 1950 conversation with other scientists about the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, Fermi responded to speculations by asking, "So where is everybody?" Plausible arguments suggest that civilizations should be common. So now the question is, why haven't we detected them? This paradox has many possible solutions, but broadly speaking, we group them into 3 categories. The first one is that we are alone. So there's ongoing kind of what the general theory is there's no galactic civilizations because civilizations are extremely rare. So rare, in fact, that we are the first to have arisen on the galactic scene. Perhaps even the first civilization in the entire universe. So the first possible solution to the paradox is that we're alone and that lives and civilizations rarer than we guess. The second possible solution to the paradox is that civilizations are common, but no one has colonized the galaxy yet, because interstellar travel is not. There are at least 3 possible reasons that this might be the case. First, interstellar travel is more difficult than we think. Second, the desire to explore is rare. And third, civilizations destroy themselves before achieving interstellar travel. These are all possibilities, but they're not very appealing. And the third possible solution to the paradox is that there is a galactic civilization, but it has not revealed its existence to us yet. We do not know which of any of these three explanations is the correct solution to the question, where are the aliens? However, each category of solution has astonishing implications for our own species. No matter what the answer turns out to be, learning it surely marks a turning point in our brief history of our species. Moreover, this turning point is likely to be reached within the next few decades or centuries, and we already have the ability to destroy our civilization. If we do so, then our fate's sealed. But if we survive long enough to develop technology that can take us to the stars, the possibilities seem almost limitless. So in this section, we learn that interstellar travel remains well beyond our current capabilities and imposes enormous difficulties. And plausible arguments suggest that if interstellar civilizations are common, then at least one of them should have colonized the rest of the galaxy. The questions now are we alone? Has there been no colonization? Are the colonists hiding? And the answers are we just simply do not know yet. So this wraps up chapter 24, where we talk about life in the universe. Throughout our study of astronomy, we keep taking this big picture view of our understandings of how we fit into the universe. Here, at last in this chapter, we've returned to Earth and examined our role of our own generation in the big picture of human history. Tens of thousands of past human generations have walked on Earth, and ours is the first generation with the technology to study the far reaches of our universe, to search for life elsewhere and travel beyond our home planet. It's up to us to decide whether we're going to use this technology to advance our species or destroy it. Imagine for a moment the grand view, a gaze across the centuries and millennia from this moment forward. Picture our descendants living among stars, having created or joined this great galactic civilization. They're going to have the privilege of experiencing ideas, worlds, and discoveries far beyond our wildest imagination. Perhaps in their history lessons, they're going to learn of our generation, the generation that history placed at the turning point and that managed to steer its way past the dangers of self-destruction and onto the path of our stars. So this wraps up chapter 24, where we talked about life in the universe, and this is the last chapter of content for this course. Make sure you guys check out the course site for all the course content and assignments associated with this chapter.